Welcome to this live talking about the anxious and avoidant trap and the kinds of trauma bonds that happen when someone with an anxious and avoidant, whether that be fearful or dismissive avoidant attachment, get together, and it's as dysfunctional as it gets. Today, I'm going to be talking about what a trauma bond is, the realities of what this might look like, some types of trauma bonds, and I'm going to be very blunt about what these kind of experiences are like. And it's my hope that this will give some people a bit of an understanding as to some of the psychology behind this and how it can really get out of hand real fast. I'm just going to set out as a disclaimer, trigger warning, this is going to be a very confronting conversation for a lot of people to hear about. So if you'd like to opt out now because it discusses trauma bonds and also the intensity of these kind of relationships and how they related to our past, feel free to opt out now because I understand it's not for everyone. With that being said, if you have any questions for me, feel free to please throw them in the question mark box below and we'll get straight into it. I want to start out with this. Trauma bonds typically are often related to topics around codependency and narcissism. Typically, people often on the internet refer to a trauma bond as a love bomb, devalue, discard cycle, which is what we normally say is what happens when you're dating a narcissist. My definition of trauma bonding is essentially when two people come together, and it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship, it could even be the way you interact with friends, with work, colleagues, certain family members. It's where two people come together and are replaying their survival behavior, their trauma together, and it's causing a lot of pain, shame, embarrassment, discomfort, and it's getting in the way of there being any proper love between these two people. So I want to make it very clear that when there is a trauma bond going on, this is when the inner children are trying to get their needs met in very dysfunctional ways. Even if they have the best intentions, it's what also means that basically when these two people are coming together, there really isn't an opportunity for there to be a foundation of proper connection, peace, and stability. And this leads into the question of, okay, well, what's trauma then? So generally speaking, when I look at trauma, I look at it as either little t, big T trauma. Your big T is for anything major, like say war, SA, or sexual assault, having an experience where there was violence. Whereas little t trauma can be moments of emotional invalidation, having experiences of verbal or emotional abuse. It's the little things that happen or didn't happen, like neglect, where even the little t's, if they build up significantly, can be as significant as one big T. And essentially what this does to the brain and how it relates to trauma bonding is that it causes people to try and replay their childhood environment to get their needs met in a way that often doesn't cause that to actually happen in the first place. So for example, what might happen is someone might choose to date an emotionally unavailable partner because internally they think in their subconscious brain that the pathway to love is dating someone who resembles an absent mother or father. That if I can finally prove myself to this emotionally unavailable person, I will receive the love that I didn't get when I was a kid. However, if you're dating someone who's emotionally unavailable, unless they're working on their stuff, it's never going to happen. And this, unfortunately, because of a lot of this subconscious stuff, if that's never resolved, people will often continue to date more of the same. And that's where trauma, an emotional experience which can take over you and also cause you to behave in very irrational ways, can occur even if consciously you know better. And this can play out in so many other facets of life outside of relationships. And I just want to make a quick point. Trauma bonding does not mean you're literally conversing about your trauma with another person and dumping and having these big emotional moments where you're like, oh, my father did this, my mother did that, my parents weren't there for me. That's not trauma bonding. Trauma bonding, like I said, is when your dysfunctional behavior in an attempt to try and meet unmet childhood needs plays out and causes problems for you. So today, I'm going to take you through some examples of this with the anxious and avoidant dynamic, and where both of these individuals, whether they be anxious preoccupied, fearful avoidant, dismissive avoidant, get stuck, and how this causes them more unhappiness and no connection in ways that also just basically fuels their existing trauma and probably gives them a very expensive therapy bill to try and work through this. So with that being said, let's dive in to the first one that I had here. And I'm listing these trauma bonds by categories that I've just come up with. And these are themes that we normally see if someone was going through like schema therapy, a type of therapy where you talk a lot about the different kind of stuff that comes up. So please bear in mind, I'm just using very loose language today around this to just help describe these different types of trauma bonds. So that way we're all on the same page. And actually, before I get started in talking about these types, I want to make something very clear. When it comes to trauma bonds, traditionally, when we look at them in terms of like very abusive relationships, people on the outside often go, well, why don't they leave? Why don't, people just sort of get out of this? Trauma bonds are incredibly addictive. They're very, very hard to break free from. And people often don't appreciate just how complex these experiences can actually be. And when people online talk about healing attachment wounds in 3 months, realistically speaking, you're looking to at least 3 to 5 years to heal, a lot of damage that was done to someone. And you've also got to think about it like this too. People who've grown up with conditioning, subconscious beliefs that lead them to unhappiness aren't going to suddenly, wake up tomorrow and have it all resolved, because what took you so long to get to where you are today takes a very long time to break free of that too. So with that all out of the way, I just wanted to offer compassion to anyone who's in an experience where currently they are in a trauma bond that may not be as extreme as a narcissistic relationship. I'm here to point out that there is a middle ground where you deal with trauma bonds with people who are just frankly have an insecure attachment, and both of you can do things which can be short-sighted and also painful. For example, someone who's, deciding to just scream and yell or send abusive text messages to someone who's emotionally unavailable. On one hand, it's problematic if you keep doing that texting behavior, even if you know better, because that could get you into trouble if you start making lies about the person. And the person on the receiving end might continuously feel like they're never good enough, and it makes them feel like they're repeating their past. But we'll get into it now. So let's start with the first one that I've got here, which is the theme of caregivers. Now, this can go both ways for those that are avoidantly attached and those that are anxiously attached. So let's start with this. What does it mean by the caregiving trauma bond? It's where one person is usually taking on the role of providing for another person, and the individual is getting something out of this experience, even if it doesn't ultimately have a net positive gain for love and connection. So the way this traditionally has played out for those that are more anxiously attached is that this is someone who might have beliefs like, I need to put myself last, other people come before me. They may have grown up with a caregiver who was maybe extremely dysfunctional, like an alcoholic, and it was all hands on deck to take care of that alcoholic. They may have grown up with an emotionally immature person who ruled the family, and they had to gather together to make sure that mummy or daddy's needs were met first, and they had to take care of them at the expense of their own well-being. This is when, for them as a child, it was all about trying to find ways to try and, make sure that the other person was happy so that way they could feel safe. As such, a basis for their style of relating is they don't feel safe nor good if the other person is doing badly. So what happens here? Usually, this is someone who's more anxiously attached, will usually go to people who are very emotionally dysregulated, chaotic, have a lot of unresolved problems, and only feel safe, in a weird, twisted way, by helping people who are extremely dysfunctional in their behavior, extremely dysregulated. And they don't feel good when they don't have someone that they can help or they can provide. And they internally believe, well, if I keep giving all this help to this person, I will feel loved, I will feel rewarded, I will finally feel like, everyone can see what a good job I'm doing, But the danger is that this often leads to burnout. The anxious attacher often becomes incredibly angry and frustrated that they're not actually getting the love that they want from this person. And they'll often complain, being like, I constantly feel like I'm dealing with a child. I feel like I'm constantly engaging with someone who, is acting like a baby. And we typically see this play out for both men and women, where they feel like they need to take care of this one person all the time instead of putting their own needs first. And this causes them to have real struggles where self-care is involved. And frankly, this is very much the definition of codependency, because this person is choosing to put the other person's emotional state ahead of their own. So that's one example of this. But avoidant attachers can also act the caregiver role in their own unique way as well too. Similar to what I was describing in today's post, we typically see people who are dismissive and even fearful avoidant attachers who may have come from neglectful or enmeshed backgrounds, taking on the role of mother or father for those who are very needy around them. So the way this plays out is that the avoidant attacher, whether they're fearful or dismissive, may choose to date people who are extremely needy. So what they'll do is they'll only feel good if they're interacting with people who are like mega anxiously attached, have a lot of what we call learned helplessness, where the individual that they're interacting with, who may be an anxious attacher, almost just can't help themselves. They're just like, their style of relating is that they need their learned helplessness in order to survive and to function. They need to act like a baby in order to get their emotional needs met, in order to feel safe, secure, and loved. How does the avoidant attacher feel? Well, on one hand, they like it because they, if they've gone through a bad experience, may project onto this person who's struggling with their weight, their finances, their career, and think, well, I know what that's like to go through this particular struggle. I really relate to you. I see so much potential in you and I want to help you out. I want to help you work through this sort of experience that you're going through. And so without actually taking a step back and maybe looking at it being like, I don't think this person has the inclination to want to work on themselves, they invest themselves deeply with very dysfunctional people who don't want to be helped. And on one hand, they feel good that they're being a good person. They feel good that they're able to be of support, that they're able to be helpful to people, because growing up as children, many avoidant attachers may have only felt good if they were being supportive to their caregivers without actually ever getting any love in return. And again, if they were dealing with a very dysfunctional parent, a chaotic relative, where they basically had to shut up, suck it up, and just kowtow to whatever's going on, maybe that was their way of being, loved, was the fact that they they had to basically do whatever it took to help the difficult people in their life. Or they realized for themselves, I need to take care of myself, and I feel bad for anyone who I also see who reminds me of a younger version of me who was cast out onto the streets, who was never able to be taken care of for themselves. They can project their own life experience onto someone else and help them. Now, how does this affect them in the long run? Short answer is, it doesn't. On one hand, it basically continues to reinforce this notion that they're going to constantly be in demand to people who want so much from them and they're never able to provide what they're looking for. So they always feel emotionally at capacity. And we have to remember too that a lot of avoidant attachers don't exactly have the strongest bandwidth for emotional support. So when they're helping out tons of people who need a lot of hand-holding, they often get to a point where they're like, well, this is really hard for me to be able to put up with. And so we find that when they date someone who's more emotionally available and wants more commitment, they hate that, because at that particular point, they're at a stage where they're just like, I am already tapped out. I'm giving all this energy and time away to all these other people in my life who are incredibly needy. I don't have time for your emotional needs. So that's one aspect. And the second insidious part of this is when they continue to give to these needy people, this is their comfort zone. Because guess what? They then don't have to be comfortable with vulnerability, helping themselves to actually overcome their fears of intimacy. So this is where it's really dangerous for avoidant attachers to stay stuck dealing with people where they feel, on one hand, a vicarious sense of, I suppose, they get off on being of help to others, but at the same time, it's not built on genuine connection because they're essentially feeding in to the trauma bond of wanting to be of help to other people who aren't helping themselves. And if that person does in fact end up helping themselves and get to a stage where they're able to manage their weight better, have improved finances, or do a better job with their career, the avoidant can actually get to a point where they're like, yuck, I don't like this anymore, because no longer can they be of help to this person. This connection has now gotten to a stage where it's getting real, and they have to also deal with the uncomfortability that they only felt good being of service. And if they can't do that anymore, then they feel like they've got nothing else to offer and they don't feel good enough to be with this person. So they no longer feel maybe that sexual attraction that they once had in supporting other people as well too. Anxious attachers in the previous example can also experience a little bit of this too, because in their own way, anxious attachers, even though they consciously may not enjoy it, may find pleasure in martyring themselves and choosing to constantly put the other person's needs ahead of their own. So when this happens, the anxious attacher with their newly reformed partner who's now working on themselves may get to a point of being like, can you go back to eating badly? Can you just I don't want you to be this way. And it's often because they themselves no longer feel like they can't prove themselves to their partner and they can't get that sense of being able to, constantly fight for being enough for this particular person. So even though consciously both people may complain about what's going on in each of these respective caregiving dynamics, they may resent actual change that happens between each other because they're not actually ready for the realities of what that involves. And it also shows their own low self-worth, which they may or may not be ready to confront. So that's an example of where that can play out for an avoidant or also an anxious attacher when they take on the role of being more of a caregiver, and that's the trauma bond that plays out in that particular example. Another example of a trauma bond that can happen is around the theme of independence. So this is a very common example that I think a lot of people who watch me will relate to. A lot of individuals who have grown up and have developed into anxious attachers may have had a caregiver or two who were aloof, distant, emotionally unavailable. And they've learned that love is something which is all about, not expressing your emotions, doing just lots of acts of service, and not really connecting through how you're feeling. They may have also grown up in school environments where they were bullied and envied the popular kids who appeared aloof, put together, and independent. So how this plays out in adult dynamics is that the anxious attacher may have a part of them that's very, very needy and also desires the popular looking person in the room because they associate popularity, aloofness, independence as safety and security. The danger here is that, as a lot of people know, those qualities may also hide an avoidant attachment. And so even though a part of them yearns for these aloof people because it makes them think, oh, that's what safety and security is, they also may consciously know that ain't healthy for me. And when they start to get more romantically involved with an avoidant attacher, the avoidant, who may have been dealing with a lot of needy people who were always looking for them for support and help, may get to a point where as closeness is developing and this anxious attacher who once appeared so aloof themselves, so self-sufficient, may suddenly become a bit of a source of disgust when they're asking for more from their partner. And the avoidant might be like, wait, I didn't sign up for this. I did not sign up to giving more emotional stuff and support to you. I don't think I can give you what you're looking for. And of course, we know that's a rationalization based on self-sabotage. But the point here is that the avoidant attacher may have once been drawn to the apparent independence of the anxious attacher, and the mere thought of interacting with someone who actually needs more from them can really irritate the heck out of them and also be a source for why they push back and leave a relationship or situationship altogether, because they were hoping to be free from having to deal with someone's emotional needs. They were looking for someone to just be as, independent and aloof as they appear to be. And for many anxious attachers who look like they're put together and are also independent, often have a great sense of loneliness. They're often incredibly lonely. They feel like no one is really able to listen and support them. They often have this belief of, well, I need to suffer in silence, or I just need to not show what I'm going through because it's dangerous or it's not helpful to burden other people with what I'm going through. And this is where things become incredibly problematic for the anxious attacher, because they have to unlearn that they need to be able to open up and speak to people, get support for their issues, and be able to work through their stuff. So it's a real learning curve in this trauma bond for people to actually learn that they need to overcome their own extrinsic independence, and also to be open to expressing themselves and be with people who can support them emotionally, and not constantly chase people who look like they're all put together or just independent, because it may not necessarily mean that it's a proper functioning relationship. So that's another example. Now, just while I'm transitioning to the next type that I've listed here, I want to take a moment just to segue a little bit into a concept that I want to talk about more in content, which is this idea of being addicted to unhappiness. Many people, in fact, I'd say all people who've suffered a form of trauma, have a level of being addicted to unhappiness. So what does that basically mean? In essence, a lot of people who have been going on in a trauma bond where, say, for example, we'll use the previous one, where they think like, say, oh, I need to be with a partner who looks aloof, independent, secure, and isn't emotional. The danger here is that if you find yourself constantly chasing emotionally unavailable people, you are acting in a way that is of someone who is addicted to unhappiness. You are constantly choosing someone who will never be able to give you what you're looking for unless they're working on it. You're also not actually about your own happiness, because you've been modeled that love is pain, struggle, trying to constantly, work for achievement and never feeling good enough. And so your template for love has been compromised by childhood experiences. And you believe that if you struggle enough, persevere, you constantly push yourself to the point of exhaustion and burnout, then that equals love. This person will finally accept and love me for who I am. And the dangerous flip side of that is that when you actually get someone who is loving and rewarding, you may push them away, regardless of whether you're anxiously or avoidantly attached, because you can't handle there being no major struggle, or also you can't handle the fact that you now have to be a real person without constantly trying to prove yourself for this individual. I'll talk more about the addiction to unhappiness in future content, but I wanted to take that moment here just to describe that when people are ongoing in a trauma bond, even if they, like I said, they consciously know it's not good for them, they may be addicted to that unhappiness because that's what feels normal, that's what's been modeled for them, and that's how they feel a sense of connection, even if it's not a genuinely positive, loving connection between two people. So, with that out of the way, let's move on to the next type of a trauma bond. Another one I've got here is seeking validation. So this is one that I see a lot of both anxious attachers and fearful avoidant attachers get themselves stuck into. And dismissives can do this a little bit too. Basically, the FAs and the APs want love and acceptance from someone who can't provide it. So they're looking for an emotionally unavailable person to provide that love for them, and they continuously chase it. So the challenge here for them is that they want, by any means, to turn the wrong person right. And they really want to work to try and tame the bad boy, the bad girl, the bad person, to make them feel like they've achieved something and that they've been able to win this person over. The danger here is that, both of these individuals might actually find that even though they consciously hate playing games, part of them feels a degree of maybe even sick pleasure from finding that they are chasing and trying to get this person to be with them in a romantic relationship. This can also play out too in friendship situations where you see someone desperately try and work for the approval from someone who's just a bit of a jerk or an asshole, and you're like, why the heck are you trying to get this person's approval? But for them, this is their way of trying to get love, because they think love, like I said, is struggle, is trying to martyr yourself, is trying to win over the approval of these difficult, dysfunctional people. And then for the avoidant, if they're on the receiving end of this, whether they be dismissive or fearful, they really feel like they're never good enough for the other person. And they constantly feel like no matter what I do, nothing I do will ever be good enough for my partner. They keep wanting more. They keep wanting XYZ. They keep wanting more stuff from me. And so it makes them continuously feel, which they already feel a lot of the time, like they're never good enough for someone that they're dating, and that they'd be better off being by themselves and not with a person who's like this. I want to also take this moment here to say, conversely, some fearful avoidant attachers and dismissives love to be chased. Some of them love the thrill of someone constantly coming back to them, because for them, that makes them feel like there's a greater degree of certainty that this person actually likes them for who they are. It makes them feel seen, worthy, loved, if they have someone who's constantly chasing them and is constantly wanting to be with them, even if they put their partner through hell by being hot and cold, deactivating, because it makes them feel like, oh, this person who I'm seeing won't leave me. They really like me. They really want to be with me for who I am, but they make it incredibly hard, unintentionally, for the other person, because they're trying to, in some ways, test the other person to see if that person will actually, follow through and put up with their behavior. And it's a very dysfunctional thing that was probably modeled back in childhood, where they had to, work through hoops for their, obnoxious caregivers. So that is something that can play itself out, on the reverse side, where avoidant attachers, like I said, enjoy to be chased. And they may get very put off when someone's not actively chasing them. In fact, they might get to the point where they're just like, they become bored, or they may just choose to turn away from someone who isn't actively pursuing them. Sounds a bit weird, because if you hear an avoidant attacher tell you, I don't want to be in a relationship with you, and you choose to consent to that and like, okay, if that's how you feel, they may get a bit disparaged and bothered that you're not actually constantly trying to chase and work for their love and attention. So there can be that's going on as well too. Another part of this is that some avoidant attachers want you to take responsibility for their decision making, for their emotional well-being, because a lot of them had that modeled when they were a kid. So that's why they might have a capacity for mind reading, expecting you to figure out what they're going through. They might expect that you should know what's going on in their head and just to take care of everything for them, because they don't want to take care of a lot of their own, adult relational responsibilities by themselves. They'd much rather you take care of that for them. So that's another area and another dimension which can play out, where they hand a lot of that emotional responsibility to their partner without verbally making that clear. And it can cause a lot of problems when they're not actually creating a proper, healthy, functional relationship. Another trauma bond that can happen is around the theme of not being good enough. So what can happen here is, if you are a child, particularly an anxious attacher, who was maybe the scapegoat of a narcissistic family structure, or one where you basically felt a bit like the black sheep. You were the odd one out. You were the one who was always picked on or made fun of by the rest of the family for maybe not being up to scratch in one form or another. You might feel like everything you do is wrong, that people just don't inherently love you, that everything you do causes someone grief in your family. So when you have people who are doing really irrational things, you might take way too much accountability for someone's bad behavior. If a caregiver leaves the family altogether and abandons their kids, you might believe that you did something to cause this person to depart. And how this plays out with anxious and avoidance is that if you're someone who is inclined to like emotionally unavailable people, you might continue trying to fight and invest in emotionally unavailable dynamics. you will continue to invest time, energy, and emotion into people who are unavailable. And when they eventually get to a point, which inevitably they will, where they're scared of growing, intimacy as friends or as lovers, they may pull away, and you may internalize this going, oh my God, what did I do? I feel like I'm in trouble. I feel like I did something wrong. And if they outright abandon you, by whether that be by a discard, an abrupt breakup, they're no longer your friends out of the blue all of a sudden, you may internalize this completely and think, oh my God, it's just like what happened with my caregiver. I feel like, nobody loves me. No matter what I do, I have a shrinking pool of friends. And you take way too much accountability for the other person's shitty behavior. And I can guarantee this won't be happening just in your romantic life. This will be happening across so many dimensions of life as well too. You will probably be struggling with friends where you get close to them and you feel like there's such a loneliness that you can't connect with anyone. And you feel like the people that you do truly connect with all leave you abruptly for no good reason, but you take it on as your responsibility. You're someone who constantly tries to fix and also repair your relationships because you take way too much accountability for the other person's side of the street. You may also struggle with work where you find yourself constantly on the receiving end of mistreatment and also bad administrative behavior, where you internalize a lot of the crap that's happening and think that it's your fault, when in fact you could be dealing with just some very difficult people. And you may frankly find that you're getting fired unfairly and unjustly because you're engaging with people who just don't like you. And it's incredibly unfair, not because you've done anything wrong, but because subconsciously you're still trying to work through the trauma of feeling like there was something wrong with you because one of your caregivers didn't like you for their own arbitrary, unfair, and unjust reasons. So that's another example of where that plays out there. And for the avoidant attachers, where they feel like they're not good enough, it links back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier, which is they constantly pour all of this time and energy into these projects, these people who are needy, and they never feel like they're good enough for the people that they're around. And they may be the golden children of a lot of household dynamics. Anxious attachers can be golden children too, but a lot of golden children, kids who've been given a lot of inflated love and appreciation for, usually in narcissistic dynamic families, often may grow up feeling like they constantly have to prove themselves to these difficult people. And so what happens here is that in romantic relationships, if they're in a position where they have to actually give more of their emotional selves to be vulnerable in a relationship, they may turn their romantic partner in their head into a villain where they constantly feel like, fuck me, like nothing that I do is ever good enough for this person. All they want is more and more, and I just can't give more to this particular relationship. Can't they see how much work I put into every aspect of our lives to try and make this work? So it can make them feel re-traumatized by being in an environment where they continuously overgive. In their head, they think that they overgive, even if the other person is getting breadcrumbs in return. And they're also scared of overgiving or giving more because they worry that if they do that, they will lose their independence, they will lose their sense of self altogether to this dynamic. So that's an example of where the not good enough can play out for the avoidant attachers when they're dealing with people of mixed extremes. Now here comes the trauma bond theme of abandonment, which is huge for anyone with an insecure attachment. Let's talk about one that happens a lot between two anxious attachers, or even two fearful avoidants, or a split of anxious and fearful avoidant. We can see that people who are have big abandonment wounds and suffer a lot of separation anxiety may come together and not even leave their side for even an instance. These individuals will be, quick to move in together, and they will barely leave each other's side, even for a minute, because they have chronically bad fears of abandonment and fears of being left alone and fears of someone betraying them and going to someone else. This is where things can start to become very controlling. Both people aren't really connecting on a grounds of safety and mutual trust. They're connecting because they will do anything to avoid the discomfort of being alone, even for a second. And this can be an incredibly intense, and sometimes it can go into the realm of physically abusive, because when you have two people who are that enmeshed together, they may resort to some very physical acts of protest behavior in order to prevent the other person from ever leaving them. And this is like codependency to the nines. Like, this is what the traditional definition would be in this particular experience. And it's not a healthy way to go for either of these people, regardless of their attachment style. So that's where things become incredibly painful for both people in this particular dynamic. Then we have other examples of fear of abandonment playing out. We know that for a lot of avoidant attachers, they have a subconscious fear of abandonment. So how do they choose to navigate this in relationships that are going reasonably well? They may fear that as things are getting closer, they will not be able to meet their partner's needs. And they also may have suffered a really bad experience of betrayal, neglect, or some form of rejection which didn't make them feel good internally. So they'll do anything to try and avoid that feeling again by taking a lot of that power out of a relationship by breaking up with someone. That's an example of where their trauma behavior comes out and they try and, take themselves out of the equation because they're so scared of being hurt by a future breakup because they believe, things just aren't going to work out anyways. They think they're doing you a favor, even though they have no way of knowing whether the relationship was ever going to work out or not. So a lot of that's very irrational, but a lot of it's stemming from them wanting to protect themselves from a perceived hurt that may never actually come. A lot of this is just irrational stuff that's coming up for them. And then we have the anxious attachers who get trauma bonded with people due to a fear of abandonment. This is where it's a very sticky situation for a lot of us anxious attachers, where we constantly choose, people who are unavailable and being constantly betrayed and abandoned over and over and over again. It's where we choose people who are going to continuously let us down, hurt us, yet even though we consciously don't pick these people because we want to be hurt and abandoned, we continuously find ourselves drawn to these people. And it could be for a myriad of reasons like that which I discussed. But if you find that you're drawn to a lot of people who abandon you, betray you, leave you, there's some trauma there. And there's definitely some stuff there where even though you may consciously know this is not good for you, a part of you is seeking out something from this experience, maybe trying to resolve something from childhood that's yet to be resolved. So that's why it's really important to be mindful if that's a recurring theme, because it may relate to the fact that you felt constantly emotionally unattuned by your caregivers. It may also relate to the fact that you want to try and turn the unavailable person into someone who's emotionally available. And in most cases, that will never happen. And it's at this point that I want to take a moment to say, I know across social media, some books online, they talk about how healing the anxious and avoidant dynamic can be if two people are coming together and are working respectively on their stuff to overcome their trauma. And to which I say that is absolutely true. In my experience, that rarely happens. And usually once the trauma has been resolved that led both people to get to that point, they realize that they've outgrown the other person and they usually go their separate ways. If they do continue working together to be in a relationship, then that's fantastic and it will go to the next stage. But it's important to bear in mind that there is this romanticization around the avoidant anxious trap, as if to say, we can come together and resolve our trauma. And I got to tell you that often these dynamics are incredibly lopsided because one person might have more baggage than the other person. One person might be seeking something from a person who they perceive as being lower in self-esteem than to themselves because that's their comfort zone. There's a lot of subconscious hidden motivations for why people get into relationships. Some of these continue to play out for decades because that's the comfort zone. So many people are not in romantically loving, healthy relationships. They've bridged together on a foundation of trauma and not on a foundation of genuine connection, peace, and harmony. So that's why I want to just make that sobering point to say, please bear in mind that whilst there is an opportunity when two people are working together to work through their stuff, and it is absolutely possible, it's hard work, but it's absolutely possible, please don't assume that you're necessarily going to buck this trend unless you have a team player and you're working on your side of the street too. Doesn't matter which way that is, because it's if you're an avoidant attacher who's working on themselves and you've got an anxiously attached partner who's doing diddly squat, it's not going to necessarily fix anything. And it would be the same in reverse as well too. Some people are working on their baggage at different rates to other people. Some people are just not even doing it at all because they prefer to keep their head in the sand. So that's just why I want to make a point here to say, yes, we can learn to heal our trauma in relationships, but I don't think that it's one of those things which always necessarily, succeeds if people aren't equipped to deal with it. I think I've got one more or a couple more of these types that I want to use. Okay, last one. So this is another one that I've kind of talked about already, but it's the last type that I wanted to talk about, which is wanting to prove yourself. So a trauma bond that can happen for a lot of anxious attachers is if they grew up where they had to be on their best behavior to their caregivers, where they had to constantly do the right thing, not put a toe out of line. The danger here is that they can constantly feel like they need to show up and be absolutely perfect. Put their needs dead last. Don't rock the boat. Don't bring anything up that might stir the pot or cause conflict. And so they become incredible people pleasers and often, unfortunately, slide into that fawn response of putting their needs dead last in order to make sure no drama happens in their relationship. This is an incredibly dangerous territory for a lot of anxious attachers because learning to overcome this and actually speak up for when they're being hurt, mistreated, can feel like death and instability for them because they're not used to the discomfort of actually having to speak up for themselves. Because often when they were younger, if they did that, they'd just be shut down immediately and told that they need to stop being so sensitive. So it can be very difficult for this group of anxious attachers to speak up for themselves, and they may often endure very difficult trauma bonds, particularly if there's an anxious attacher with a fearful avoidant, where the fearful avoidant is doing their own thing, is behaving however they want, and the anxious attacher is putting up with it without actually being like, we need to talk about this and I need to put me first because this is just insane. And this is where things become incredibly dysfunctional because the anxious attacher might think, I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to act like the cool girl, cool boy, cool person and not rock the boat. And then, of course, they don't get their needs met. They also build up tremendous resentment inside of them and they feel unloved, unseen, unheard, betrayed, abandoned by this person that they're dating. Often we see in straight men this subtype play out with the trope of nice guys. Nice guys, who are typically anxious attachers, are men who are straight, who have this subconscious belief that they are not worthy, they are not good, they must fight and prove their love to another person, a woman, in order to feel good about themselves. They will pick the girl who looks like they're an absolute dream and constantly chase them in order to feel better about themselves. They will not have boundaries. They don't even know what that is. They don't know how to communicate and express themselves. They usually don't have a very strong sense of self or a strong identity for themselves to be able to actually assert themselves. And they may often find themselves being taken advantage by fearful avoidants who actually don't want to have someone who's making them feel controlled. That is an example of a trauma bond where the nice guy meets the cool girl and that becomes an incredible mess where low self-esteem and control issues start to run riot between the two of them. It's a stereotype and it does happen a lot. Or you can also find a lot of nice guys who lack a lot of internal self-esteem feel bad when they're constantly doing things for others and they never feel reciprocated or appreciated for what they're doing, even though they're too intense and they don't feel like being themselves is enough. It's like they have to show off the car, the gifts, the home. They need to constantly provide for the other person without actually taking a step back and being like, I don't need to do all of this. I am enough. I am worthy by myself. If someone loves me for who I am, that is enough. I don't need to do excessive amounts in order to feel loved. So that's an example of the trauma bond that can happen for nice guys under a more straight context. I've yet to hear of examples of that play out in LGBTQI plus settings, but considering so many of these are similar, it wouldn't surprise me if there are some, variations of the nice guy, the good girl in LGBTQI plus spaces as well too. It can usually play out quite similarly. Finally, the other one of wanting to prove themselves that plays out a lot for avoidant attachers is when they pick people who are so dysfunctional, addicts, narcissists, and they constantly give and give and give to these difficult, needy individuals because part of them wants to prove to them, how good they are on surface to people by constantly being of service to other people. They will complain to people all the time how terrible this needy person is. Talk about how annoying it is to deal with this narcissist. Go to therapy usually to resolve the issue, and they'll usually resolve it very quickly because guess what? There wasn't a lot of love there between them and that person in the first place. And they may excuse leaving at first, being like, oh, but what will they do without me? I'd feel bad if I were to leave this person. They have mental health issues. And this is where it becomes an absolute nightmare because their ego lives and dies on them being a good person for these difficult people. And that when they finally get into a connection with someone who's not as dysfunctional, makes them feel incredibly uncomfortable because they're not used to that. So this is where a lot of avoidant attachers need to learn to overcome their comfort zone of dealing with the difficult people and actually learn that fighting for an impossible love and fighting for these difficult people does not mean they're a good person. In fact, it's putting them on the back burner for life, and it just causes them to have tremendous depression, burnout, and a lot of other existing issues. Anyways, that's the examples I wanted to come up with for the kinds of types of trauma bonds that can happen between anxious and avoidant pairings. I hope that this has given people a bit of an understanding as to how this plays out, the themes, and how this can also show up between different types of anxious, avoidant, fearful avoidant people as well too, because there's lots of overlap and it's not all one and the same. So I hope that this has given people a bit of an insight into how that all shows up. With that all being said, I'm going to now transition into Q&A. I'm going to run in the next half an hour. So if I can get through these questions, I'll feel pretty good and proud of myself. And yes, as always, this will be saved and put down on my feed later. All right, let's get into Q&A. First question. Was it even real? Did he pull back because I was too good? Is she a rebound for his feelings for me? Help. Okay, I'm going to be honest. My answer is I don't know in your particular case because I don't know what's going on there. I would honestly need to speak to you in person. I can see this is part 2 of something, but I can't see part 1. I'm going to assume, based on the fact that part 1 isn't there, that I'm going to put it like this. Traditionally, when there is growing intimacy between a person and an avoidant attacher who isn't working through their stuff, like genuine positive feelings of love, kindness, empathy for another human being, this starts to freak an avoidant attacher out. And I can understand the confusion a lot of people have because they go, oh my God, was this even real? They've just bounced into this new relationship off the back of ours. What the hell's going on? I'm here to say that it most likely was real, what you had, because their reaction to this relationship to freak out the way that they likely have and gone on to someone new probably indicates that it was too real for them and it freaked them out. That's one aspect of it. Given your reaction to this and the intensity of what I'm reading from this, it suggests to me that this was quite sudden and it was full on and it came out of nowhere. So that does lead me to believe this is an example of an avoidant case. But I want to also, for a minute, because I don't know you and your situation all that well, take a moment of devil's advocacy. I personally hate devil's advocacy, but I'm here to put it out there anyways because I think it's important to think about this. There are people out there who frankly may not have an issue that's related to attachment. They just may not love you. And I don't know, like I said, this particular case, but I'm here to say that unfortunately, there are people who, get into relationships and situationships because it's comfortable where they don't actually have to feel any love for the other person. There are other times people who just realize very quickly, I don't love you. Even if you tick a lot of good boxes, you're a great person, but there's no romantic feelings from me to you. That can happen. So I just want to state, again, without knowing the full picture of this, it's important to consider the fact that there are individuals who don't have exclusively an attachment issue. Sometimes it can be just a case of I'm not feeling it, and it's just not for me. So wanted to throw that out there. Although in this particular case, I don't think that it's that example, but it can show up from time to time. All right, next one. What are your thoughts on blocking an ex on the phone if the trauma bond is turning ugly? Sorry if my last post was too long. I don't think I saw it. Okay, so generally speaking, some of you may have watched a video that was reposted recently about my thoughts and feelings with regards to blocking. I'm going to summarize. Generally speaking, if you can block, fantastic. That's great. I just find that for those that are not comfortable with blocking, it's a little bit too hard. And that's why I think it's better to find ways to, create distance and space and just take one micro step back instead of necessarily going block, goodbye, never want to, engage with you until you work on your shit. I'm at a stage where I can block people quite comfortably when it's turning ugly. I don't do that very often, mind you, but sometimes it's essential in this age of social media because prolonged access to someone who's hurting me doesn't make me feel great. Now, with that being said, is it a good idea to block in the case of a trauma bond? Look, if it were me and I was at my stage with where I'm at, if I was going to block someone because the trauma bond between me and this person was getting ugly and I'd done everything I could to try and work on it from my end, absolutely I would. Like, nah, 3 strikes, you're out, I'm done. Or whatever, happened to me, I'd be like, nah, I'm not putting up with this. So, yeah, go ahead. I think blocking is totally reasonable in, cases that involve trauma bonds. But again, it depends on context. Without knowing what you're going through specifically, how comfortable you are with the idea of blocking, I don't know. So I'm not 100% sure on that. I've got another question here, which is, how do you know if it was real or if they were just not that into you? Okay, I'm going to start this out by saying something that's going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of people, which is, I don't know. And a lot of us won't ever really know the answer for that because sometimes it's not always, we don't 100% know if certain individuals with absolute certainty have an attachment issue. We can't get your ex into therapy and be like, hey, can we just go over your past relationships and figure this stuff out? We don't know. That's just one aspect of it. Typically, what we find with people who have an avoidant attachment is that there is consistency to the pattern of behavior that typically happens for a lot of people where feelings are involved. We find that the pattern goes, they get together with you, there is growing connection, depth, intimacy, and at a certain point, they may abruptly end the relationship or situationship out of fear of getting closer and committing to you. So when that happens, absolutely the feelings were real based on the pattern of behavior that we academically know, not just academically, but also in practice. And that's been written about in a lot of books and material like Facing Love Addiction, Why Men Can't Love. I think it's actually called Men Who Can't Love. And also He's Scared, She's Scared. That's just behavior that's very consistent and it relates to trauma around fears of intimacy. But when it's someone who genuinely does not romantically love you, now that's a different story altogether. The way that plays out, in my experience, is one example can be you're getting to know someone, you want to make it work, you want to get to know this person, and every time you go out, there's just this feeling of just like, I'm just not feeling what I'm looking for with this person. Yeah, they tick a lot of boxes, they're a lovely person, they have golden retriever energy, I love the fact that they call me consistently, but I'm just not feeling it. And just a link to what one person here has said, that's so different from someone who dials down the connection and it's like a huge shock for the person. Meaning that an avoidant attacher is likely to do a sudden 180 and just end things after exclaiming how much they love you, the connection, promising to go on holidays with you, maybe even just coming off the back of a holiday with you too. So different from someone who feels that, they never felt it and it never grew. And they got to a point where they're just like, sorry, I'm not feeling it. It's very cut and dry. They're not going to put you through an experience where they're telling you things like, I love you. I really see us being in a relationship together. I can see us getting married. They're not acting from that place of euphoria. If anything, they're a bit measured and just like, not really, I'm not really feeling it. So that's where I'd say there's a big distinction there. The other kind that can play out too is some anxious attachers I find often get themselves into long-term relationships and even avoidance too, where they just genuinely don't love the partner that they're with. And that's coming from a place of fear of actually being with someone who could genuinely love them. So I'm here to say that anxious and avoidant attachers can absolutely get themselves into long-term relationships where they genuinely aren't romantically connected to their partner, but it's safe for them. A classic example of this playing out is for closeted gay men and maybe even closeted lesbian women, bisexuals, who find comfort in a heteronormative situationship or relationship because it beats being out of the closet, because being out of the closet is scary and also freaky because they're worried about being judged. So that's why I'd say it's important to say this category of people who genuinely didn't like you absolutely exists, but there is a distinctive lack of that pattern of behavior where it was like, this person has a history of romantic issues with their previous relationships. This person likely has a background of being enmeshed with a caregiver or had extreme emotional neglect. This person, dates you with intensity only to be hot and cold, stonewalling, backpedaling, ghosting you out of nowhere. If there is that fear of intimacy, maybe that's what I'd say this to make it really reductive. If there is a sudden shift that was going from like everything's green flags to all of a sudden it's over, it is likely, we can't say with 100% certainty, but it is more than likely to be a case that the feelings were real. This is an issue with the fear of intimacy, and this person ended it. So that's why I want to just say that it's important to understand that distinction, because I don't want to make it seem like, well, just because they didn't want to be with you, that must mean they're avoidantly attached, because we have to fulfill that criteria of fear of intimacy before we go, this person just, has an avoidant attachment when in fact they don't, it was not actually there at all. So wanted to make that clear because there goes my phone. Sorry, guys. Because I think that it's very easy for some people. I haven't seen this from my clients. In fact, all my clients, I think, genuinely have been through an experience with an avoidant attacher. But there is a danger sometimes of people just villainizing anyone who doesn't like them and being like, they're a narc, they're an avoidant, because they don't want to deal with the fact that egg's on their face. And it's like, this person just didn't want to be with you because they didn't like you romantically. So I just wanted to throw that out there. All right, back to Q&A. Oh my God, there's more here. Not that I mind. Okay, why is the chase so intoxicating? Even after the hardest lessons, I'm still drawn to them. I'm assuming you're still drawn to your avoidant partner. But I stop myself because now I know so much better. But when does this stop happening? My easy short answer, when you heal your childhood trauma. It's very hard to overcome the need to chase and also be chased by someone when you have unhealed attachment wounds. And that is something that only you and a mental health professional, a 12-step recovery program, some form of integrated healing can start getting you working on. So it takes time. Believe me, it's an ongoing effort. And people who have attachment wounds will never fully, completely heal 100%, but they will significantly reduce a lot of those experiences to the point where it's no longer completely plaguing their lives and causing them to do irrational stuff. Good question though, by the way. Why do avoidants say they aren't ready for a relationship, then date shortly after a discard? Okay, well, in the moment when they say they're not ready for a relationship, they absolutely mean it. Something inside of their head has just gone, I can't see myself being in a relationship. It feels so much better when I'm single. And then a little while after that, they feel guilt and shame over their actions, which, by the way, if you're feeling guilty, embarrassed, and shameful about your behavior, and your behavior was, came about because of irrational stuff, because of some emotional stuff, chances are that's coming from trauma. And if you do feel that sense of guilt and shame, you'll often try and do anything to avoid such feelings again. And the way the avoidant attachers usually deal with it, let's go into a fresh new relationship. It's like jumping country, right? When shit's gone down and you don't want to deal with it, so many people just want to vacate and be like, I want to go to like a magical island and just get away from all of this. The new relationship serves as a magical island for a lot of avoidants to have to just put the past behind them and to move on. So that's why that plays out in that particular way. How to differentiate they don't like me or really attachment issues. I feel like I've answered that one, but great question. Is this part of like multiple questions or is this just the one? No. Okay. 2, fearful avoidance. We ping pong each other between anxious and avoidant tendencies. I'm trying to be more secure, hoping to break this dynamic. Curious to know your thoughts. I'm going to just say that 1, I think it's wonderful that you both recognize you have a fearful avoidant attachment style and you're trying to work through it. I'd argue that 2, fearful avoidance, trying to work on it, is some of the hardest work both of you will ever do. Because usually what happens is the minute one person starts to become more secure, the avoidancy crops up maybe in the other person. And that's when it becomes almost like an anxious avoidant dynamic. And it's trauma everywhere on so many levels. I think from my experience, what really helps is both people need to be seeing therapists and both people need to take it very slowly because fearful avoidants have a tendency to rush, like intensity, and love the idea of certainty. They just want to know that they've got the right person. And the danger is that we will never be 100% certain of a lot of things in life when it comes to relationships or jobs or, things that we enjoy. So I think a big part of that is getting more comfortable with uncertainty and also with abandonment. And that can be bloody hard. So I'd say good on you for recognizing your role to play in this without, unfortunately, because I can't provide a, play-by-play of like what you should do because I don't know you and your partner. I can't say what's best for either of you. But I would say that both of you, I think, definitely need ongoing accountability and support from a mental health professional or team of people. That's what I would say. Let's go to the next question. When avoidants just bury their feelings and move on, they haven't ever processed their feelings. But do these feelings come up? For example, later in a midlife crisis or something? Yes. So typically we find that avoidant attachers who go through a bit of grief and pain. I actually had a few people reach out and tell me this. Often when they're in therapy, they often then have to deal with the guilt of being such a shit human being to other people. And I know it sounds harsh. It's not my language to describe them. It's literally what they tell me. They're like, oh my God, I feel so bad about myself. And they take criticism incredibly strong. So this is usually when they'll be like, oh my God, can you anxious attachers stop attacking us? Which I get and respect. But frankly, by that particular point, the damage is done and they have such a bag of guilt and shame that they have to work through. I'm not someone with avoidant attachment, but guilt and shame are some of the worst feeling emotions one can go through. So often it's pretty disgusting for them to work through. And it's part of the reason why they may even drop out of therapy because it's so hard to work through. It's really painful. So yes, it does come up for them and it's brutal to navigate as a client. Next person says, he cried when he initiated breaking up with me. He kept lingering around when I agreed. I was wondering he noticed he was repeating his pattern or he just didn't care. Oh, I was wondering if he noticed he was repeating his pattern or he just didn't care. Hard to say. I don't know what that person was crying about, but I have heard of some avoidant attachers crying because I think that they genuinely like you and I think in that moment it's almost just like they don't want to be a bad person for letting you down because they feel so shit about the idea of looking bad for doing what they did to you. I think it's more coming from that people-pleasy place more than anything else at that particular point in time. So you got to remember too, usually at that particular point in time, they don't even know what happened and they can't even provide a strong reason as to why they shut down the way that they did. And it can feel really confronting for them to be in a position where they're about to get screamed at because, they just destroyed a relationship without realizing what happened. So that's my interpretation of that one. Can you truly overcome and heal your attachment style? Short answer is yes. You can get to a point where it's just not impacting you the same way it normally has. Or is it more about becoming self-aware of your style and being able to have the tools to self-regulate? I think it's more advanced than that. The awareness piece, phenomenal. Better yet when you regulate. But a lot of that regulation and awareness is more like forensic stuff where you can see the cracks that are causing problem in the foundation of who you are. And then it's really important that you have systems in place, like having a therapist, like having your own self-therapy sort of tools to be able to glue in and also work through that and to try and heal some of that stuff. Because you want to make sure that even though you will never probably heal from like all the scars, you want to get it to a point where you're not scabbing at it over and over again, metaphorically speaking. So that way it's not causing you to behave in the ways that you have. It's there, but it's not like plaguing your decision making. So it's basically taking the irrational heat out of some of those emotional scars. That's my answer to it. Next question. When it's said that they block, suppress, and bury their feelings for you, how does it really work? How is it done? Is it something subconscious? Or up to which extent is a voluntarily executed thing? My best answer as someone who has not gone through a phase of suppressing their feelings is, from what I understand, it just sounds like their brain, from what I understand, involuntarily just basically puts all that stuff out of mind, out of sight, as a way of just trying to protect them from painful feelings. I think a lot of us do that in one area or another. Like, for example, if there are some painful thoughts and feelings, we might try and just, shove it down. But from the way it's described, due to the intensity of it, it's described in such a way where it sounds like they just put that shit away, without really much control on their part, because it just becomes so overwhelming. So that's what I would say to answer that. But I don't unfortunately have MRIs or brain scans. I don't have a lot of avoidants who even really know what's going on a lot of the time when that happens. Like, they know that it's happening, but they often find it very hard to overcome it when their brain is fighting them. So that's why I say it seems more like it's in the realm of involuntary stuff. I know that's not a very satisfying answer for a lot of people because they think it is intentional. I'm like, a lot of research would suggest that it's not, but anyways. How can we be sure this time it will work with a fearful avoidant? Are there any signs we can check before getting back together, or specific questions we can ask? I don't want to get hurt again, but I want to believe in his capacity to be more secure together. Okay, that is such a great set of questions. One, have they taken time to reflect on what they've done to you in the previous relationship? Are they coming back because they're guilty and shamed by how they behave? And as a consequence, are they also in therapy to work on their stuff? Because if the answer is no, then they haven't changed, and they probably don't even realize what they've done or the extent of the damage that they've done. So bear in mind, they would need to be in 3 to 5 years of therapy to overcome their stuff before properly even thinking about getting back with you. And by that point in time, you'll probably be in a mentally and emotionally different place. But if you still want to, give them a chance, I think that they've got to realize that they were the one who was responsible for what happened with the breakup. And I think it's important to ask questions like, hey, what's the reason you're coming back to me now? What have you learned off the back of the previous experience? And I'm going to be very blunt. Do not get back into a romantic relationship with them straight away. In fact, make them a friend and start dating someone else. I know that sounds harsh, but the thing is, a lot of them ruminate and obsess about whether or not they can meet your emotional needs. You are probably going to give them a greater sense of relief and also responsibility if you are able to get your emotional needs from a new person, and that might encourage them to be like, well, shit, I actually want to work for, someone like you, and I need to work on myself so I never let that happen again. And it might provide them with the inclination to, actually want to work on their stuff. Now, you don't have to do what I'm saying. I'm just saying what I would do. But the point simply is to say that, if you're going to open that door again, you're welcome to do it. I think no one's, I don't think it's a bad idea to try. But history has often shown that if that fear of intimacy hasn't been conquered, it's going to rear its head again. And even those that have been to therapy who are avoidantly attached, they often need an accountability team to call them out when that stuff comes up, because often it's just very hard for them, to overcome themselves. I can see someone here says, is journaling good or bad for a failed relationship when the avoidant dumps you, or can this be worse for you? No, I think journaling is fantastic because it's a format for regulating your emotions and putting them down on paper. So I absolutely love it, but it depends on how you do it. All right, which type of avoidant tells you it's over out of nowhere and wants no contact, and then starts showing up places where they know you will be and acts like a stalker? Probably a fearful avoidant attacher, but then again, sometimes that can also be dismissive avoidance. I'm going to put my money and say more likely the fearful avoidance. How often do you see an avoidant block and unblock you within... Okay, this is same person who was asking this question, definitely fearful avoidant, the previous one. How often do you see an avoidant block and unblock you within days and weeks on social media? Both profiles are private except for stories, yet they still do it. Are they emotionally triggered? Avoidant gave me not ready for relationship, yet they now are in a new relationship 2 months later. Okay, to answer your question, I can't reasonably give you an answer as to how often I see an avoidant block and unblock their partners within days or weeks of each other. But typically the fearful avoidants do this a lot, and I'm sighing about it because it's really destructive on everyone. So I think that, I personally think that it's just really harmful behavior when they do that, because they're trying to control how they feel about themselves because they feel pretty shitty. So they try and pin a lot of this and project a lot of this onto you to make them feel better about themselves. I can't say how often this happens, but I'd say it does happen a lot with fearful avoidance. Dismissive's less so in my experience. What type of avoidant is very in love, then suddenly freaks out all over, back 5 times, gone 4 months? Fearful avoidant, 100%. Fearful avoidants have a proclivity for sudden breakups, and also, not that dismissives can't too, but fearful avoidants typically are what I describe as the boomerang avoidance. Not every fearful avoidant behaves this way, but those that do, I sort of roll my eyes and go, oh my God, can you just see what you're doing is destructive? But of course, when they're in a trauma bond, I know it's not that easy for them to see what they're doing, and they're going through their own emotional hell. So I sort of look at this from 2 lenses: the clinician, and also as someone who's on my client's side, where I'm like, oh, for fuck's sake, get it together. So it can be, frankly, I have multiple ways of looking at it, and it's just annoying at times when I see this play out this particular way. It's just hell. Because it's addictive for you, the person who's going through it, and also for them, because they don't know why they're behaving this way. And they keep projecting all of their shit onto you. And they're not also taking off an accountability for what they're doing to you. They're lonely, they miss you, and all that's genuine. They want love and connection, but they keep blowing it up because they're freaked out over abandonment issues as well too, and fears of getting close. So it's frustrating. The behavior is frustrating. Let's see. When an avoidant doesn't seek therapy, can they bury their feelings forever? Buried being not processed. Well, a lot of them will go to their grave without ever working through this stuff. So I think it's one of those things where you've got to bear in mind, avoidant attachers are doing a lot of work to try and turn their brain down. That's why so many of them are addicts. So many of them resort to unhealthy coping mechanisms to just switch their brain off. And it's why often, a lot of them will do anything to try and manage the noise in their head because it's so painful for them. A lot of them actually find relief in meditation when they finally work on their stuff, and also do some somatic-based healing exercises too. But until those moments, oh God, it's hard for them every day, and they feel chronically lonely. A lot of them have massive depression and anxiety issues that they aren't even aware of. And a lot of, their behavior is done to just suppress all of that baggage that they've got inside them. It is the ultimate redemption story when these people go to therapy and work on themselves and realize, yeah, I fucked up. And I was also hurt by bad relationships as well too. And I want to work on this stuff. So absolutely huge positives come out of this journey for them when they start working through it and forgiving themselves. But my God, is it hard work. All right, I'm going to answer a couple of more and then I'm going to bounce because your boy's got work to do. He ended things after telling me he was so in love with me. I have heard from him twice since this. Will he be back, do you think? He might be. Some avoidant attachers do come back around and others don't. And I think it really does depend a lot on the individual, how they related to you, how they feel about you in terms of their own self-esteem. So I can't give you an exact answer to say he will definitely be back, but I'm going to say the likelihood could be high. So bear that in mind, because I often tell my clients, yeah, you should be prepared for them to potentially spin back around. Not because I'm trying to give you false hope, but if anything, it's just to be like, you've got to be mentally and emotionally prepared for this person to turn back around. Someone's asked here, why do they come back? Loneliness, boredom, depression, they're big catalysts for them returning. Not because they're using you, but because they genuinely miss you. And a lot of those positive feelings often return once they separate from them, from you. That's why they often get the Phantom X experience, because they're like, shit, I miss being with this person. I fucked up. I feel bad about this. So, that can absolutely happen from time to time. All right, last question, and then I'm out. My fearful avoidant and I tried to be friends. Communication was too nice, so they pulled back and stonewalled. 2 months of silence, and they messaged me out of the blue to say their boundaries and that they want to be friendly, but not friends. What the F? Okay. Some fearful avoidants have very rigid boundaries. They're not boundaries, they're walls. And they often don't tell you what their boundaries are until you've stepped on it without even realizing it. Now, the danger here for the avoidant who does this is they're not properly communicating to you what their triggers are. And because often they're very sensitive to stuff that's going on around them, you may step on something without even realizing it. And then a lot of this has to do with control issues. Many of them were badly controlled as kids. So what do they do now? They're trying to control you, project all of their stuff onto you because they think you've triggered them by stepping on a boundary. And now it's just like, how dare you do this to me? You can't tell me what I can do. And so this is not an act of trying to be friendly with you. This is an act of trying to control you to feel safe about themselves. Classic trauma bond. And it's done as a way to prevent them from feeling hurt by something that's likely not going to hurt them. They're just freaking the fuck out about being closer to you. But the thing is that when we get close to people, we probably are going to step on something that's a trigger. And how we go about communicating that and resolving that is important. Going about it in the way of stonewalling you for 2 months and then coming back being like, okay, I want to be friendly, but we're not friends. And unilaterally creating boundaries as a way to manage that is not healthy boundary setting. It's walls. It's controlling behavior. And they certainly aren't working through their triggers. This is a fearful avoidant who's in hypervigilance mode and is trying to control you to feel better about themselves. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for being part of this TED Talk. I hope that you all have a wonderful day wherever you may be. And I will be back on to do more content down the line. And yeah, it was really good chatting with everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. And I'll be back next time probably to talk about, the addiction to unhappiness, because I think that's a concept that I'm really keen to discuss with people.